February 22, 1944. 11:47 a.m. Gotha, Germany. Margarete Schaller, 8 years old, sits at her family's kitchen table on Mohrenberg Street, practicing arithmetic in a composition book while her mother prepares lunch. The late morning sunlight slants through lace curtains, casting familiar patterns on the wooden floor she's known since birth. Her father is at the rail yard, her older brother evacuated to the countryside the previous autumn. The radio plays softly in the corner, classical music interrupted occasionally by announcements she doesn't fully understand. At 30,000 feet above the North Sea, 2nd Lieutenant James Mahaffey, 23 years old from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, sits in the bombardier's position of a B-17 Flying Fortress, part of the 398th Bombardment Group's formation approaching central Germany. This is his 7th mission. The briefing this morning identified the target as Gotha's Messerschmitt aircraft factory, a legitimate military objective producing Bf-110 fighter bombers that intercept American formations over Europe. Intelligence photographs show the factory complex, railway connections, worker housing nearby. Acceptable collateral damage, the colonel had said. Necessary sacrifice. Mahaffey doesn't think about the people below. Can't afford to. At this altitude, Germany is an abstraction, a patchwork of fields and cities reduced to map coordinates and bombing tables. The northern bomb site's crosshairs will find the factory. The bombardier's job is mechanical, mathematical. Wind speed, altitude, airspeed, drift. Release point calculated, bombs away, tight formation turns for home. He's good at his job. His crew counts on his precision. In Gotha, Margaret's mother steps outside to shake out a tablecloth. The morning is cold but clear. She pauses, looking up at the sound she's learned to recognize even before the sirens begin. A low rumble, distant but growing, like thunder that doesn't stop. She drops the tablecloth and runs back inside. The air raid siren starts wailing 3 seconds later. The cellar is familiar but never comfortable. Margaret's mother grabs her daughter's hand, pulls her toward the stairs. No time to gather possessions, no time to lock the door. Just get below ground. Now. The neighbors are already there. Frau Hartmann with her infant son. The elderly Webers from next door. Young Anna Becker, home on leave from her nursing duties. They know each other's breathing patterns, each other's silences. This is the 4th raid this month. The sound grows. B-17s don't whisper. For Wright Cyclone engines per aircraft, 18 aircraft per squadron, 3 squadrons in a group. The mathematical symphony of American industrial power, translated into acoustic waves that rattle windows and shake foundations before the first bomb falls. The bombers are still 90 seconds away from their release point. Margaret presses her hands over her ears. Her mother holds her close. In the lead bomber, Mahaffey watches the initial point flash by beneath his position. IP reached, turn on to bomb run heading 087 degrees. The formation banks together, practice precision. Below, the city of Gotha resolves from abstraction into reality. Streets, buildings, the distinctive shape of the Messerschmitt factory complex. His job is about to begin. Flak begins bursting around the formation, black puffs of 88mm explosive, each one capable of shredding aluminum and flesh. He ignores it. Focus on the crosshairs. 11 seconds to release. The bombs fall in stick formation, 2,500-pound high explosive bombs leaving each B-17's bomb bay at precise intervals. Physics takes over. Gravity, wind drift, terminal velocity. The bombs that Mahaffey releases at 11:51 a.m. will reach the ground in approximately 47 seconds. He doesn't watch them fall. Nobody does. The formation is already turning, increasing speed, heading for the North Sea and England and debriefing and coffee and trying not to think about what just happened 30,000 feet below. But physics doesn't care about intent. Wind conditions at altitude are different from the forecast. The bombing pattern drifts 300 yards east of the factory. One stick of bombs walks directly across Mohrenberg Street. The first explosion hits the Weber's house. The second destroys the Becker residence. The third obliterates the building where Margaret's family shelters in the cellar. The concussion wave hits first. Pressure change so sudden that eardrums rupture before minds can process what's happening. Then sound, a physical force that crushes air from lungs. Then darkness as the building collapses inward, 3 stories of brick and timber and furniture and all the accumulated weight of ordinary life crashing down into the cellar. Margarete Schaller survives. Her mother does not. Frau Hartmann's infant son does not. The Webers, who were too elderly to reach the cellar quickly, do not. Anna Becker survives with a crushed leg that will never heal properly. In 7 minutes of bombing, 43 civilians on Mohrenberg Street die. The Messerschmitt factory sustains minor damage to one assembly building and resumes operations within 11 days. Above the North Sea, Mahaffey fills out his after-action report. Target bombed as briefed. Observed good concentration of explosions in target area. Moderate flak, no fighter opposition. Crew performance excellent. All aircraft returning to base. He signs his name at the bottom. The report goes into a file. The mission is over. Time for debriefing and hot coffee and trying to sleep without seeing those black puffs of flak. But the mission isn't over. Not for Margarete. Not for the 8-year-old girl who will spend the next 4 hours trapped in darkness beneath 3 stories of rubble, listening to her mother's breathing stop. Not for the adult she will become, carrying that February morning in every dream, every sudden loud noise, every moment of silence when memory floods back unbidden. The war would end. The bombers would go home. The pilots would become veterans, honored for their service, celebrated for their courage. And somewhere in the mathematics of strategic bombing, in the necessary calculations of acceptable collateral damage, in the space between military objectives and human consequences, a debt was created. An equation that wouldn't balance. A weight that couldn't be calculated in tonnage or altitude or bomb load. 28 years would pass before that weight found resolution. Before the man who released those bombs and the girl who survived them would stand face to face. Before reconciliation became possible. Before forgiveness could even be considered. But first, they would have to find each other. James Mahaffey came home to Cedar Rapids in November 1945. He'd completed 25 missions over Germany, earned an Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters, and received an honorable discharge with the rank of first lieutenant. The local newspaper ran a story about his return. His parents held a welcome home dinner. Friends asked about his experiences, and he gave them the answers they wanted to hear. Stories about camaraderie, about close calls with flak, about the satisfaction of striking back at the enemy. He didn't tell them about lying awake in his bunk at Nuthampstead Air Base, calculating and recalculating bomb trajectories. He didn't mention the nightmares where the crosshairs centered not on factory buildings but on individual faces. He didn't describe the sick feeling in his stomach every time he signed an after-action report stating, "Target bombed as briefed," while knowing that bombs never land exactly where mathematics promises they will. He used the GI Bill to finish his engineering degree at the University of Iowa. He married Dorothy Chen, whose parents had emigrated from China before the war. They had 3 children. He worked for John Deere, designing agricultural equipment. He attended church on Sundays, coached Little League baseball, served on the school board. He was a good father, a reliable husband, a respected member of his community. But sometimes, driving to work in the morning, he would see a particular quality of light slanting through clouds, and his hands would grip the steering wheel tighter. Sometimes, hearing distant thunder, he would freeze for a moment before remembering where he was. And sometimes, reading newspaper accounts of the expanding war in Vietnam, of tonnages dropped and targets destroyed, he would feel a weight in his chest that no amount of rational explanation could ease. He never talked about it. Men of his generation didn't. The war was over. They had won. What more needed to be said? In Gotha, Margarete Schaller spent 6 weeks in hospital after the bombing. Fractured ribs, ruptured eardrum, severe concussion. The physical injuries healed. The psychological ones did not. She moved in with her father's sister in Leipzig after her release. Her father, broken by his wife's death, could barely care for himself, let alone a traumatized child. She grew up silent. Her aunt tried to draw her out, tried to restore some sense of normalcy, but Margarete had learned that normal could be destroyed in an instant. That safety was an illusion. That the sky itself could betray you. She finished her schooling without distinction, found work as a clerk in a textile office, married a machinist named Klaus Drescher who asked few questions about her past. They had one daughter, Ilse, born in 1955. Margarete was a careful mother. Overprotective, some said. She never let Ilse out of her sight longer than necessary. She woke sometimes in the night to check that her daughter was breathing. She couldn't explain the fear. How do you tell a child that you learned at age 8 that mothers stop breathing, that buildings fall, that the world can end between heartbeats? The East German state didn't encourage dwelling on wartime suffering. The official narrative was clear: fascism had been defeated, socialism was the future, individual trauma was subordinate to collective progress. Margaret learned to keep her memories private. But on February 22 every year, she would wake before dawn, unable to return to sleep, and wait for the day to pass. In 1961, the Berlin Wall went up. Margaret and Klaus were on the eastern side. Their world contracted. Foreign travel became impossible. The West was enemy territory, capitalism's decadent corruption. American bombers had destroyed Gotha, and now America was the enemy again, this time in ideological terms. The symmetry felt appropriate to Margaret. The people who had killed her mother were unreachable anyway. She never imagined meeting them. Never imagined wanting to. What would be the point? What could possibly be said? But in 1970, something shifted. West Germany's Chancellor Willy Brandt began pursuing Ostpolitik, normalization of relations between East and West. Cultural exchanges began, carefully managed but genuine. A program started allowing East German citizens to correspond with West Germans under certain conditions. Margaret paid little attention. She had no one in the West to write to. Her daughter Ilse did. At 15, she became interested in music, specifically in Western rock music that filtered through despite official disapproval. Through a school exchange program, she began corresponding with a West German student in Hanover. The letters had to be approved by authorities, but they went through. Ilse was thrilled. Margaret was terrified, though she couldn't articulate why. In Cedar Rapids, James Mahaffey's children grew up and moved away. His son went to law school. His daughters married and started families of their own. Dorothy died suddenly in 1969, an aneurysm that gave no warning. Mahaffey found himself alone in a house full of memories, working a job that no longer fully engaged him, moving through routines that seemed increasingly hollow. He started attending meetings of the 398th Bombardment Group Association, veterans gathering to remember and honor their service. The first meeting felt awkward. What did you say to men you hadn't seen in 25 years? But gradually, something unexpected happened. They started talking, really talking, about things they'd never discussed when it mattered most. About the fear that never quite left. About the calculations that haunted them. About the knowledge that they had killed people, probably many people, and that those people had faces and names and lives that ended because of decisions made at 30,000 feet. Not everyone wanted to talk about it. Some men insisted the bombing had been necessary, justified, morally unambiguous. But others, like Mahaffey, found relief in acknowledging the weight they'd carried. At the 1971 reunion in Dayton, Ohio, someone mentioned a program. A Lutheran minister in Germany was organizing reconciliation visits, connecting American veterans with Germans who had experienced the bombing. It was controversial. Some veterans called it traitorous. Others saw it as therapeutic, necessary even. The minister's name was Hermann Licht. He lived in Gotha. Mahaffey sat in the hotel ballroom, listening to the debate, and felt something shift inside him. Gotha. He remembered the name from his mission logs. He'd bombed Gotha on February 22, 1944. He'd destroyed the Messerschmitt factory, the after-action report said. But what else had he destroyed? Who had lived beneath his crosshairs? For 27 years, he'd avoided asking those questions. Maybe it was time to stop avoiding them. He wrote to Hermann Licht that night. The letter was stilted, uncertain. I was a bombardier in the 398th Bombardment Group. I bombed Gotha on February 22, 1944. I would like to understand what happened that day from the other side. I would like to meet someone who was there. The letter went into the mail. Weeks passed. Mahaffey almost forgot about it, almost convinced himself it had been a foolish impulse. Then, in March 1972, an envelope arrived from East Germany. Inside was a letter from Licht, and with it, another letter. Handwritten in careful English, translated by someone who clearly struggled with the language. My name is Margarete Drescher. I was Margarete Schaller when your bombs fell on my street. I lost my mother that day. I almost died. I have spent my life trying to understand why it happened. Reverend Licht suggested I might find answers by meeting the person who dropped the bombs. I do not know if this is true. But I am willing to try. If you are willing to come to Gotha, I am willing to meet you. Mahaffey read the letter 3 times. His hands were shaking. For the first time in 28 years, the girl in the rubble had a name. And she wanted to meet him. Planning a trip from Iowa to East Germany in 1972 wasn't simple. Cold War bureaucracy created barriers that had nothing to do with distance. Mahaffey needed a visa from the East German government, sponsorship from a recognized organization, documented justification for the visit, approval from American authorities who viewed any contact with communist nations with suspicion. The process took 5 months. He used the time to prepare in other ways. He requested his service records from the National Archives. When they arrived, he spent an evening reading through documents he'd barely glanced at 28 years earlier. Mission logs, target folders, intelligence reports, after-action summaries. The February 22 mission to Gotha was described in 3 pages of bureaucratic prose. Target, Messerschmitt Bf-110 production facility, Gotha, Germany. Weather, clear, visibility excellent. Opposition, moderate flak, no fighter contact. Bombing results, good concentration of impacts observed in target area. Estimated 40% damage to primary objective. Assessment, mission successful. Nothing about Mohrenberg Street. Nothing about 43 civilians. Nothing about an 8-year-old girl trapped for 4 hours beneath rubble. The report was accurate in what it documented and utterly incomplete in what it omitted. He found the actual bombing photographs in his mission folder. Reconnaissance imagery taken after the raid, showing blast patterns and damage assessment. He'd never looked at these photos carefully before. Now he examined them with borrowed reading glasses, tracing the bomb impacts across the cityscape. There, the factory. And there, 300 yards east, a residential area. The photographs showed destroyed buildings, collapsed structures, streets blocked with debris. Mathematics had seemed so clean at 30,000 feet. On paper, in these grainy black and white images, it still looked clinical. Structures damaged. Infrastructure degraded. Targets eliminated. But Margaret's letter had given those abstractions weight. Each collapsed building represented families. Each crater marked lives that ended. The mathematics of strategic bombing excluded the things that mattered most. In Gotha, Margaret was preparing differently. She'd agreed to the meeting but couldn't articulate why, even to Klaus. What did she hope to gain? Closure? Understanding? Revenge? None of those seemed quite right. Maybe she just needed to see the face of the person whose calculations had ended her childhood. Maybe she needed to make him real, as she'd been made real to him through her letter. Reverend Licht visited her twice before Mahaffey's arrival, preparing her for what the encounter might involve. He'd organized several such meetings between German civilians and Allied veterans. Some had gone well, ending in genuine reconciliation and healing. Others had been disasters, opening old wounds that never should have been disturbed. He couldn't predict which category this meeting would fall into. He's coming because he feels guilt, Licht told her. That much is clear from his letters. But guilt isn't the same as understanding. And understanding isn't the same as forgiveness. You need to be prepared for the possibility that this meeting won't give you what you're hoping for. What am I hoping for? Margaret asked. Licht shrugged. That's what you need to determine before he arrives. She spent the summer of 1972 trying to answer that question. She told Klaus about the bombing for the first time in their 17-year marriage. Not the clinical facts, which he'd always known, but the details. The sound of her mother's breathing stopping. The darkness. The weight of debris on her chest. The moment of rescue when light broke through and hands pulled her up and she saw her mother's body, crushed beneath a wooden beam, eyes open but seeing nothing. Klaus listened without interruption. When she finished, he held her while she cried. They'd been married nearly 2 decades, and this was the first time she'd allowed herself to fully grieve in his presence. The wall she'd built around that day began to crack. She also talked to Ilse, who was now 17 and fiercely political in the way teenagers could be. Ilse's initial reaction was anger. Why would you meet with an American bomber pilot? They destroyed our country. Killed thousands. And now one wants to come here and ask for forgiveness. Why should you give it to him? I don't know if that's what he wants, Margaret said. I don't know what either of us wants. But I was 8 years old when it happened. I've carried it for 28 years. Maybe it's time to put it down. How will meeting him help you put it down? Margaret had no answer. But she knew she had to try. In September 1972, Mahaffey flew from Chicago to Frankfurt, then took a train through the border controls at Checkpoint Charlie into East Berlin. The Cold War geography felt surreal. He was entering enemy territory, or what his government considered enemy territory, to meet someone his bombs had tried to kill 28 years earlier. The absurdity wasn't lost on him. Reverend Licht met him at Berlin Ostbahnhof station. They took another train to Gotha, 2 hours through countryside that looked peaceful and ordinary and nothing like the bomb-scarred landscape Mahaffey had seen from 30,000 feet in 1944. Licht briefed him during the journey. Margaret is fragile, he said. She's carried this trauma her entire adult life. She's never fully processed it because the East German system doesn't encourage individual grief. You represent something very complex to her. The person who killed her mother, yes. But also perhaps the person who can help her make sense of senseless suffering. I don't have answers for her, Mahaffey said. I was following orders. Doing my job. I believed the target was legitimate. Was it? Licht asked. The question hung in the air between them. Was bombing a factory that produced fighter planes legitimate? Strategically, militarily, yes. Obviously yes. But when that bombing killed 43 civilians, when it traumatized a child for life, when it created wounds that never healed, was it legitimate then? I don't know, Mahaffey finally said. I've been asking myself that question for 28 years. They arrived in Gotha at dusk. Licht had arranged for Mahaffey to stay at a church guest house. The meeting with Margaret was scheduled for the next morning at Licht's home. Neutral ground. A place where both could leave if the encounter became unbearable. That night, Mahaffey walked the streets of Gotha. The city had been rebuilt, like most of Germany. New buildings stood where his bombs had fallen. The Messerschmitt factory was gone, replaced by some kind of machinery plant. Mohrenberg Street had been reconstructed, though several lots remained vacant, their original buildings never replaced. He stood on the street where Margaret had lived, trying to imagine February 22, 1944 from ground level instead of 30,000 feet. Trying to picture the street as it had been before his bombs fell. Trying to comprehend that this quiet residential neighborhood, now home to workers and families who knew nothing of what happened here, had once been a target coordinate. Grid reference 51 degrees 33 minutes north 10 degrees 42 minutes east. Drop zone. Acceptable collateral damage. The phrase tasted like ash in his mouth. Tomorrow, he would meet Margarete Drescher, who had been Margarete Schaller when she was 8 years old and his bombs destroyed her world. Tomorrow, 28 years of calculations and guilt and unanswered questions would come face to face with 28 years of trauma and grief and survival. Neither of them knew what would happen. Neither of them knew if reconciliation was even possible. But they were willing to try. And that willingness, perhaps, was the beginning of something. September 12, 1972. 10 a.m. Reverend Hermann Licht's living room, Gotha. Margaret arrived first. She wore a simple blue dress, her dark hair pulled back, her hands clasped tightly together to keep them from shaking. She'd barely slept. Klaus had offered to come with her, but she'd refused. This was something she needed to do alone. Ilse had hugged her at the door that morning, whispering, "You don't owe him anything. Remember that." But that wasn't quite true. She owed herself something. She owed the 8-year-old girl who'd survived something. And maybe this meeting was how she would deliver it. Licht served her coffee she didn't drink. They made small talk she didn't hear. The clock on the mantel ticked through minutes that felt like hours. Then, at precisely 10:15, the doorbell rang. James Mahaffey stood in the doorway, and Margaret's first thought was how ordinary he looked. She'd imagined many things over the years. The face of the person who killed her mother. The monster who dropped bombs on residential streets. The enemy who destroyed her childhood. But the man Licht ushered into the living room looked like someone's grandfather. Gray hair, reading glasses in his shirt pocket, gentle eyes that held an expression she couldn't quite name. Sorrow. Guilt. Fear. They stood across the room from each other for a long moment. Licht had planned to make formal introductions, to guide the conversation, but found himself unnecessary. The two people who needed to speak to each other had already begun communicating without words. Mahaffey spoke first. His German was poor, limited to what he'd learned in preparation for this trip, so Licht translated. Thank you for agreeing to see me. I know this must be difficult. Margaret's English was better, learned in school and maintained through Ilse's studies. You came a long way. 28 years, Mahaffey said, and something in his tone made clear he wasn't talking about distance. They sat down. Coffee was offered and refused. Licht asked if they wanted him to facilitate the conversation or leave them alone. Margaret chose facilitation. She wasn't sure she trusted herself to maintain composure without a mediator present. Tell me what you remember about that day, Mahaffey said. If you can. If you want to. And Margaret found that she did want to. Maybe that's what she'd needed all along. Not forgiveness, not revenge, but witness. Someone who would listen to what happened from her perspective, who would acknowledge that beneath the crosshairs had been a real child with a real mother who loved her. She told him about the morning. The arithmetic book. The radio playing Brahms. Her mother shaking out the tablecloth. The sound of engines, the sirens, the descent into the cellar. The Webers and the Becker girl and Frau Hartmann's infant son. The pressure wave and the collapse and the darkness. I could hear my mother breathing at first, she said. Then I couldn't. I called to her. I kept calling. I thought maybe she was unconscious, that she would wake up if I just called loud enough. But she didn't wake up. And I was trapped there with her body for 4 hours before they dug us out. Mahaffey's hands were clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. I didn't know, he said. I mean, I knew there would be casualties. We always knew. But I didn't know you. I didn't know your mother. I didn't know Mohrenberg Street existed. What did you know? Coordinates, he said. Target designations. Factory buildings. I knew the Messerschmitt plant was producing aircraft that were shooting down our bombers. I knew we needed to stop production. I knew the mission was justified. And now? The question hung in the air. Mahaffey removed his glasses, cleaned them though they weren't dirty, a gesture of deflection that bought him seconds to think. I've asked myself that for 28 years. Was it justified? Strategically, militarily, I still think yes. We were at war. Your country was producing weapons used to kill Allied airmen. We had to stop that production. But... He trailed off. Margaret waited. But, he continued, I've thought about what strategic bombing means in human terms. I did the calculations recently. The 398th Bombardment Group dropped approximately 12,800 tons of bombs on German targets during the war. If we use conservative estimates of civilian casualties per ton dropped, that's at least 3,000 civilian deaths attributable to my group alone. And I personally participated in 25 missions. If I assume equal distribution, which I know isn't accurate but stay with me, that means I was responsible for approximately 300 civilian deaths. His voice had become clinical, falling into the old patterns of calculation and rationalization. Margaret recognized the defense mechanism. She'd used similar ones herself. But those aren't numbers, she said quietly. Those are 300 mothers and fathers and children. 300 people who had breakfast that morning and didn't have dinner that night. I know, Mahaffey said. That's what I've been trying to tell myself for 28 years. I know. But knowing it intellectually and feeling it are different things. When I received your letter, when you became real to me, when you stopped being a number in a casualty report and became Margaret who lost her mother, that's when I started to feel it. Is that why you came? To feel it? Partly, he admitted. But also to tell you I'm sorry. Not that sorry changes anything. Not that sorry brings your mother back or gives you back your childhood. But I am sorry. For what it's worth. Margaret had imagined this moment many times over the past months. In some versions, she screamed at him. In others, she forgave him immediately. In still others, she walked away without speaking. But now that the moment was actually here, she found herself feeling something unexpected. Not rage, though part of her thought she should feel rage. Not immediate forgiveness, though that would be easier. What she felt was a strange sense of recognition. Because sitting across from her wasn't the monster she'd imagined. It was a man who'd also been carrying weight for 28 years. Different weight than hers, but weight nonetheless. My daughter asked me why I wanted to meet you, Margaret said. I couldn't give her a good answer. But I think I know now. I needed to see that you're human. I needed to understand that what happened wasn't done by a monster who wanted to hurt me specifically. It was done by a human being who was trying to do what he thought was right, who was following orders, who was part of something larger than himself. Does that make it better? Mahaffey asked. No, Margaret said. But it makes it different. It makes it something I can maybe begin to process instead of just carrying as pure trauma. They talked for 3 hours. Licht remained present but largely silent, letting the conversation develop its own rhythm. Mahaffey described his war, the fear at 30,000 feet, the flak that killed his friends, the knowledge that every mission might be his last. Not to excuse what he'd done, he made clear, but to explain the context in which he'd done it. Margaret described her life after the bombing. The nightmares that persisted into adulthood. The hypervigilance that made her an overprotective mother. The way certain sounds or lights could transport her instantly back to that cellar. The decades of wondering why she'd survived when her mother hadn't. I used to think God saved me for some reason, she said. That I survived because I was supposed to do something important. But I never figured out what that important thing was. I just lived an ordinary life. Got married, had a daughter, worked a boring job. Nothing that justified surviving when so many others died. Maybe survival doesn't need justification, Mahaffey said. Maybe it's enough that you lived. Is it enough that you lived? Margaret asked. You survived 25 missions when so many others didn't. Did you find your important thing? Mahaffey was quiet for a long time. I raised 3 children, he finally said. I designed farm equipment that helped feed people. I coached Little League and served on the school board and tried to be a good neighbor. Like you, nothing extraordinary. But maybe that's enough. Maybe the measure of a life isn't whether it's extraordinary but whether it's lived with as much decency as possible given the circumstances. Were you living with decency when you bombed my street? The question was direct, challenging, but not hostile. Margaret wasn't attacking him. She genuinely wanted to know. I thought I was, Mahaffey said. I believed I was fighting for something good, stopping something evil. The Nazis were evil, that much was clear. And the people who produced weapons for the Nazis were enabling evil. But I didn't think carefully enough about the cost. I didn't ask myself whether stopping weapon production justified killing the people who lived near the factories. I just accepted what I was told, that this was necessary, that this was justified, that this was war. And now? Now I think war is more complicated than the people who wage it want to admit. I think the categories we use, good guys and bad guys, justified and unjustified, necessary sacrifice and unacceptable cost, I think those categories fail to capture what actually happens when bombs fall on cities. You weren't an acceptable sacrifice. Your mother wasn't collateral damage. You were human beings whose lives mattered as much as mine or my crew's or any American soldiers. But we didn't think about that in those terms. We couldn't. If we'd really confronted what we were doing, I don't know if we could have done it. Should you have done it? Margaret asked. I don't know, Mahaffey said honestly. I genuinely don't know. I still think the Nazis had to be stopped. I still think the war was necessary. But I think we could have fought it differently. With more care. With more attention to who was beneath the bombs. I think we were so focused on winning that we stopped asking what winning was costing the people we weren't supposed to be fighting. The conversation reached a natural pause. Licht brought fresh coffee, which this time they both drank. Outside, normal life continued. Children walked home from school. Cars passed on the street. The world kept turning, indifferent to the weight being processed in this small living room. I don't forgive you, Margaret said finally. I want to be clear about that. I don't forgive you because I don't think it's my place to forgive you. You didn't do this to me personally. You did it to hundreds of people, most of whom are dead. I can't forgive you on their behalf. I understand, Mahaffey said. But, Margaret continued, I don't hate you either. I thought I would. I thought meeting you would give me a target for all the anger I've carried. But you're not the target. You're just another person damaged by the same war that damaged me. We're on different sides of the same wound. Mahaffey nodded slowly. Different sides of the same wound. I like that. It's more accurate than victor and victim. We're both victims, Margaret said. In different ways. And maybe that's what I needed to understand. That what happened to me wasn't personal. It was the inevitable result of systems and decisions and choices made by people who never saw my face. You saw my face now. Does it change anything? Everything, Mahaffey said. And nothing. It doesn't change what happened. But it changes how I carry it. I've been carrying guilt as abstraction, guilt about numbers and statistics and mission reports. Now I'm carrying guilt about you specifically. About Margaret. And somehow that's easier to bear because it's real. They talked until late afternoon. At some point, the conversation shifted from the bombing to their lives after. Mahaffey talked about his children, his wife who died, his work. Margaret talked about Klaus and Ilse, about living in East Germany, about the small satisfactions of ordinary life. They found common ground in unexpected places. Both loved classical music. Both had complicated relationships with their countries. Both had spent decades trying to make sense of senseless things. When they finally stood to leave, there was an awkward moment where neither knew quite how to end the encounter. A handshake felt too formal. A hug felt too presumptuous. They settled on a brief clasp of hands and direct eye contact. Thank you for coming, Margaret said. Thank you for being willing to see me, Mahaffey replied. Will you write to me, she asked. After you return to America? If you want me to. I do, Margaret said. I think I would like to continue this conversation. And so they did. The letters began in October 1972 and continued for the next 17 years, until Mahaffey's death in 1989. They were irregular at first, one every few months, careful and formal. Gradually, they became more frequent, more personal, more honest. East German censors read every letter Margaret sent and received, but they found nothing subversive in the correspondence. Just two people trying to understand what war had done to them. Mahaffey wrote about the other missions he'd flown. Not the tactical details but the psychological weight. The mission to Berlin where they'd lost 3 aircraft to fighters. The raid on Hamburg where the firestorm had been visible from 30,000 feet, aglow against the night sky that didn't fade for hours. The growing sense as the war progressed that they were no longer just hitting military targets, that strategic bombing had become something darker, something he couldn't quite name. Margaret wrote about the years after the bombing. The recurring nightmares that didn't fade with time. The way she'd flinched at sudden noises well into her 30s. The overprotectiveness with Ilse that Klaus had gently tried to moderate. The anniversary of February 22, which she'd never acknowledged publicly but which had shaped every year of her life. They wrote about guilt. Mahaffey's guilt for what he'd done. Margaret's guilt for surviving when others hadn't. Both recognized the irrationality of survivors' guilt but couldn't shake it. Why had Mahaffey's aircraft returned safely when so many others were shot down? Why had Margaret lived when her mother and the Webers and Frau Hartmann's baby had died? The questions had no answers, but asking them together somehow made them more bearable. In 1975, Margaret wrote about Ilse leaving for university in Leipzig. The apartment felt empty without her. Klaus worked long hours at the machine shop. Margaret had time to think, perhaps too much time. She found herself returning to memories she tried to suppress. Not just the bombing, but before. Her mother's laugh. The way morning light came through the kitchen window. The ordinary moments that seemed precious now in their absence. Mahaffey wrote back about becoming a grandfather. His daughter's first child, a boy named after Mahaffey's father. Holding the infant had triggered unexpected emotions. This was continuity, he wrote. This was the future that the war had been fought to preserve. But he couldn't help wondering about the futures that had been destroyed. What children had Margaret's mother never gotten to meet? What grandchildren had the bombing erased from existence? The letters weren't all heavy. They also wrote about books and music, about gardening and weather, about the small details of daily life. Mahaffey described Iowa winters, snow covering his backyard, cardinals at the bird feeder. Margaret described Gotha's reconstruction, new buildings rising where ruins had been, the city slowly forgetting its scars while she remembered hers. In 1978, Margaret wrote that she'd visited Mohrenberg Street for the first time since the war. She'd avoided it for 34 years, couldn't bear to see where her childhood had ended. But something had shifted. Maybe the correspondence with Mahaffey had made the past more manageable, had turned trauma into story. She walked to where her house had stood. A new building occupied the lot now, built in the 1950s. Different architecture, different families. No memorial marker, no acknowledgement that anything significant had happened there. She stood on the sidewalk where she'd walked to school as a child, and for the first time, she could remember the good parts without immediately being pulled into the trauma. Her mother's face appeared in her memory without the overlay of death. The kitchen table where she'd done arithmetic. The lace curtains. The radio playing Brahms. The memories were still painful, but pain without rage, grief without bitterness. She wrote to Mahaffey about the visit. About standing where the bombs had fallen and feeling, not forgiveness exactly, but something like release. She'd carried that February morning as an open wound for 34 years. Maybe it was time to let it scar over. Mahaffey wrote back about visiting the Air Force Museum in Dayton. They had a B-17 on display, restored to pristine condition. He'd stood beneath it, looking up at the bombardier's position where he'd spent so many terrifying hours, and felt like he was looking at an artifact from someone else's life. Had he really been that young man who believed precision bombing could be surgical? Had he really signed those after-action reports without interrogating what acceptable collateral damage actually meant? But standing there, he'd also felt something like compassion for his younger self. That 23-year-old bombardier had been doing the best he could with the information and framework he'd been given. He believed he was fighting for something good. The fact that good intentions had led to terrible consequences didn't make the intentions meaningless. It just made the world more complicated than young men at war wanted to acknowledge. The correspondence deepened over the years. They wrote about mortality, about legacy, about what it meant to have lived through the most destructive war in history and to have been both perpetrator and victim, aggressor and damaged. They wrote about their children, hoping the next generation would find better ways to resolve conflicts than dropping bombs on each other's cities. In 1984, Margaret's husband Klaus died of a heart attack. She was 48 years old and suddenly alone in a way she hadn't been since childhood. Ilse was married now, living in Dresden with her own family. Margaret wrote to Mahaffey about the loneliness, about facing age in a system that had no patience for individual grief. Mahaffey's letter in response was the most personal he'd ever written. He wrote about Dorothy's death, about the emptiness that followed. About learning to live with absence. About finding meaning in small things when the large things had been taken away. He wrote that their correspondence had become one of those small meaningful things. That knowing Margaret, understanding her life, had given weight to his guilt in a strange way that made it more bearable. Guilt without a face is paralyzing, he wrote. But guilt directed toward a specific person, toward you, that's something I can work with. I can't undo what happened, but I can bear witness to your life. I can acknowledge what was taken from you. And maybe that's a form of restitution, inadequate as it is. Margaret wrote back, "You're right that restitution is inadequate. But it's also all we have. You can't give me back my mother. I can't give you back your innocence. But we can give each other witness. We can say, I see what happened to you, I acknowledge it, I carry it with you." And maybe that's what reconciliation means. Not forgetting, not forgiving necessarily, but carrying together. In their final years of correspondence, as both aged and health declined, the letters became less about the war and more about time itself. About the strange experience of being old, of carrying decades of memory, of watching the world change in ways neither had imagined. East and West Germany still divided when they began writing. No one imagined reunification. No one imagined the Soviet Union collapsing. History moved in directions that made their old enmities seem increasingly distant and irrelevant. Mahaffey's last letter arrived in March 1989. His handwriting had deteriorated, the script shaky and difficult to read. He'd been diagnosed with cancer, he wrote. Advanced, inoperable. He had months, maybe less. He wanted to thank Margaret for the correspondence, for her willingness to meet him, for helping him understand what his war had meant from the ground level. "I don't know if there's an afterlife," he wrote. "But if there is, maybe I'll see your mother there. Maybe I can tell her I met her daughter, that she grew up strong and thoughtful and graceful despite what happened. Maybe that won't mean anything to her. But it means something to me. Knowing you has meant everything." Margaret received that letter the same week the Berlin Wall fell. November 1989. The Cold War ending just as her correspondence with James Mahaffey ended. The symmetry felt meaningful, though she couldn't articulate exactly how. She wrote one final letter, knowing it would arrive too late, knowing Mahaffey would likely never read it. But she wrote it anyway. "Thank you for seeing me," she wrote. "For making me real to you. For carrying what you did as personal responsibility rather than abstract guilt. I don't know if that changes anything cosmically. But it changed something for me. It let me be more than just a victim. It let me be Margaret, a person with a life and thoughts and meaning beyond what happened on one February morning. That gift is inadequate to repay what was taken. But it's also everything." The letter was returned months later, marked deceased. But Margaret kept it anyway. Along with all the other letters, carefully preserved in a box that she would pass on to Ilse, who would eventually donate them to a museum in Gotha dedicated to reconciliation and remembrance. The correspondence between Margarete Drescher and James Mahaffey would have remained private, known only to them and Reverend Licht, except for an accident of history. In 1990, as East Germany integrated into the West and archives opened, a journalist named Thomas Brenner was researching a book about Allied bombing of German cities. He interviewed Licht, who mentioned the reconciliation program he'd organized in the 1970s. Brenner asked about specific cases. Had any been particularly meaningful? Licht hesitated, bound by confidentiality, but Margaret had recently given him permission to share her story. She'd turned 54 in 1990, watching her country transform around her, feeling that the Cold War divisions that had structured her adult life were finally dissolving. Maybe her story could help others understand something about war and reconciliation and the long work of healing. Brenner interviewed Margaret in early 1991. She showed him the letters. All of them, 17 years of correspondence between a German survivor and an American bombardier. Brenner recognized immediately that this was extraordinary. Not because the basic facts were unique, many similar meetings had happened across Europe as veterans and civilians sought reconciliation. But because the letters documented something rare, the long, difficult process of two people working through trauma together. His book, Brief aus der Asche, Letters from the Ashes, was published in 1992 and became an unexpected success in Germany. Readers responded to the honesty in the correspondence, the lack of easy resolution, the acknowledgement that some wounds don't heal but can perhaps be transformed into something more bearable. The book was translated into English in 1994 as Letters from the Ruins. Reviews in American publications were mixed. Some praised the book's nuanced exploration of moral complexity. Others criticized it as rehabilitation of German victimhood narrative, arguing that focusing on German suffering obscured the larger context of Nazi aggression. Veterans groups were particularly divided. Some saw value in acknowledging the human cost on both sides. Others saw it as betrayal of the mission, as suggesting that Allied bombing campaigns were morally equivalent to Nazi atrocities. Margaret found herself thrust into public attention she hadn't sought. Interview requests came from German and American media. Documentary filmmakers wanted to tell her story. She declined most requests. This wasn't about celebrity or even about broad political statements. This was about one specific relationship between two specific people trying to make sense of one specific event. But she did agree to speak at schools occasionally. Particularly in the newly reunified Germany, where young people were grappling with how to understand their nation's divided history. She would show up at gymnasiums in Gotha, Leipzig, Berlin, and talk to students about February 22, 1944. Not as a lecture on strategic bombing or a condemnation of Allied tactics, but as a story about what happens when abstractions become real. The pilot who bombed my street didn't see me, she would tell students. He saw a target coordinate. An industrial objective. Acceptable collateral damage. I didn't see him as a person either. I saw American bombers, enemy aircraft, the people who killed my mother. We were both operating with abstractions. And abstractions allow us to do terrible things because they protect us from confronting the human consequences of our choices. She would pause, letting that sink in. James Mahaffey gave me a gift by agreeing to meet me. He made himself vulnerable. He acknowledged what he'd done without trying to justify it away. And in doing that, he helped me stop seeing him as an abstraction. He became a person. And when he became a person, my anger had nowhere to land. I couldn't rage at a person the way I could rage at an abstract enemy. Students always had questions. Usually the same ones. Do you forgive him? Would you do it again if you could change the past? Did meeting him really help? Margaret's answers were honest. I don't forgive him in the traditional sense. I can't forgive him for killing people who aren't me to forgive for. My mother might have forgiven him if she'd lived. The Webers might have. But they didn't live, so I can't speak for them. Would I meet him again? Yes. Every time. Because before I met him, I was trapped in victimhood. The bombing was something that happened to me, that defined me, that I had no control over. After meeting him, I had agency. I could choose how to carry the weight. I could choose what the bombing meant in the larger context of my life. Did it help? Yes and no. It didn't give me back my childhood or my mother. But it gave me a way to integrate the trauma into my life story instead of having it be the only story. It let me be more than just the girl who survived the bombing. The impact rippled in unexpected directions. Other survivors of Allied bombing reached out to Margaret. Some wanted help connecting with American or British veterans. Others just wanted to share their stories with someone who would understand. Margaret found herself part of an informal network of people who'd been trying to process similar traumas for decades. In Iowa, Mahaffey's children learned about their father's correspondence only after his death, when his executor found the letters Margaret had sent. His son called her in 1990, shortly after reunification made such calls easier. They spoke for 2 hours, the son trying to understand this aspect of his father's life he'd never known about. He never talked about the war much, Mahaffey's son said. We knew he'd been a bombardier, knew he'd flown missions over Germany. But he never mentioned feeling guilty about it. He never mentioned you. Men of his generation didn't talk about those things, Margaret said. They carried their weight silently. But I think the correspondence helped him. It let him process what he'd been carrying. The son asked the question everyone eventually asked, did you forgive my father? Margaret gave her standard answer, which was also the true answer. Forgiveness is complicated. I don't think it's binary, where you either forgive or you don't. I think it exists on a spectrum. I released my anger toward your father. I acknowledged his humanity. I recognized that he'd been damaged by the same war that damaged me. Whether that counts as forgiveness, I don't know. But it let me move forward. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, Margaret was invited to speak at a reconciliation ceremony in Coventry, England. Coventry had been devastated by German bombing in 1940, and the cathedral ruins had become a site of peace and reconciliation work. The organizers wanted speakers who could address the human cost of aerial bombing from multiple perspectives. Margaret stood in the ruined cathedral, looking at the shell of what had been one of England's great medieval churches, destroyed by German bombers following the same logic that American bombers would later follow over Germany. Acceptable collateral damage. Strategic necessity. The language of war that allowed people to do terrible things and sleep at night. She spoke without notes. I stand here as someone who received what Coventry gave. My city was bombed just as yours was bombed. We used different flags and different languages, but the experience was the same. Terror, loss, destruction, trauma. And for 50 years, we've been told that this was necessary. That this was justified. That this was the price of war. But I want to suggest something different. I want to suggest that strategic bombing of cities was a moral failure on all sides. Not because the people who ordered it or executed it were evil. But because they allowed abstractions to override human reality. They calculated tonnage and industrial capacity and military advantage. They forgot that beneath the bombs were people. Actual human beings with names and faces and lives that mattered. James Mahaffey, the man who bombed my street, wasn't evil. He was a 23-year-old doing what his country asked him to do. The German pilots who bombed Coventry weren't evil. They were young men following orders. But the system that put them in those positions, that gave them the weapons and the targets and the moral framework that said this was acceptable, that system was deeply flawed. I met James 30 years after he bombed my street. And what I learned was that he'd been carrying guilt for 3 decades, just as I'd been carrying trauma. We were both victims of that flawed system. And our healing came not from one of us forgiving the other, but from both of us acknowledging that we'd been caught in something larger than ourselves. So what do we do with that knowledge? How do we honor the dead and the damaged? I think we do it by refusing to accept the abstractions that made such destruction possible. We insist on seeing the human cost of our choices. We refuse to let military necessity override moral responsibility. We remember that every target coordinate represents lives, families, futures that will never exist. My mother's name was Anna Schaller. She was 36 years old when she died. She loved music and gardening. She taught me to read. She made the best potato pancakes in our neighborhood. These details don't appear in any military report. But they're more important than tonnage or target designation or mission success rates. Because they're what was actually lost on February 22, 1944. I can't give those details to all the people who died in Coventry. I don't know their names or their stories. But I can honor them by refusing to let their deaths be reduced to abstractions. They were people. They mattered. And their loss should grieve us, regardless of which side of the war we were on. The speech was received in silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of disagreement, but the weighted silence of recognition. In the audience were British survivors of the Coventry bombing, German veterans who participated in that raid, families on both sides carrying their own versions of the same wound. After the ceremony, several people approached Margaret. A British woman who'd lost her father in the bombing. A German veteran who'd flown one of the planes. An American pilot who'd bombed Dresden. Each carrying their own weight, each looking for some way to process what war had done to them and through them. They shared stories. They acknowledged each other's pain. No one offered easy forgiveness or simple reconciliation. But they stood together in those cathedral ruins and recognized a shared humanity that war had tried to erase. Margaret returned to Gotha feeling that she'd completed something. Not closure, which is a myth. But integration. The bombing was part of her life story now, not the entire story. She was more than just the girl who survived. She was a mother, a grandmother by then, a person who'd lived a full life despite terrible beginnings. In 2004, on the 60th anniversary of the Gotha bombing, the city installed a memorial on Mohrenberg Street. A simple stone marker with the names of the 43 civilians who died. Margaret attended the dedication. She was 68 years old, her hair white, her daughter Ilse beside her, Ilse's children there as well. 3 generations, living proof that trauma doesn't have to be fatal, that life continues even when it seems impossible. The marker didn't mention the Messerschmitt factory. Didn't mention strategic bombing or military necessity. Just the names and the date. February 22, 1944. A recognition that these lives mattered, that their loss should be remembered. Margaret placed her hand on her mother's name. Anna Schaller. After 60 years, the wound hadn't healed. But it had changed. It had scarred over in a way that allowed her to touch it without being destroyed by it. Margarete Drescher died on March 15, 2018, at the age of 82. She'd lived 74 years after the bombing, a full life by any measure. She'd been a wife, mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. She'd survived the war, survived the division of Germany, survived reunification. She'd witnessed more history than most people experience in several lifetimes. Her obituary in the Gotha newspaper mentioned the bombing briefly, in the context of her later reconciliation work. But the headline wasn't about victimhood or trauma. It read simply, Margarete Drescher, 82, teacher of reconciliation. Because in her final decades, that's what she'd become. Not through seeking publicity or making grand statements, but through the patient work of helping others process their own war trauma. She'd answered letters from survivors across Germany. She'd met with several American veterans who'd sought her out after reading about her correspondence with Mahaffey. She'd spoken at schools when asked, always with the same message, abstraction enables cruelty. Humanity prevents it. Never forget the faces beneath the crosshairs. Ilse organized a small memorial service at the Mohrenberg Street marker. Perhaps 50 people attended. former students her mother had spoken to over the years. Neighbors. Family. A representative from the city council. And, unexpectedly, someone else. Thomas Mahaffey Jr., son of the bombardier, now 68 years old himself. He'd flown from Iowa to Gotha specifically for the service. Ilse had informed him of her mother's death, having maintained contact with the Mahaffey family over the years. Thomas had inherited his father's letters from Margaret, had read them trying to understand the man his father had been beneath the stoic exterior. At the service, Thomas asked if he could speak. Ilse agreed, curious what he would say. "I never knew my father struggled with what he'd done in the war," Thomas began, his German halting but sincere. "He never talked about it. He seemed proud of his service, proud of helping defeat the Nazis. And he was proud. But he also carried something else, something he only revealed in his letters to Margaret. After he died, I found those letters. Reading them was like discovering a different person. The father I knew was confident, straightforward, certain of his choices. The man in those letters was uncertain, questioning, haunted by the knowledge that his good war had killed innocent people. Margaret gave my father a gift. She gave him permission to acknowledge that complexity. To say, yes, stopping the Nazis was necessary, but no, that doesn't make every action taken in pursuit of that goal justified or honorable. War is full of impossible choices, and good people can do terrible things while believing they're doing right. I came here today because I wanted to honor the relationship my father had with Margaret. They never became friends exactly. How could they? The gap between them was too vast. But they became something more important than friends. They became witnesses to each other's humanity. And in doing that, they showed that healing is possible even when wounds are permanent. He placed flowers at the memorial. White roses, the same flowers his father had sent to Margaret years ago, delivered to Gotha through complicated Cold War logistics. After the service, Ilse and Thomas walked through Gotha together. The city bore little resemblance to its 1944 incarnation. Modern buildings, busy streets, cafes full of young people who knew nothing of strategic bombing or living in fear of air raid sirens. History had moved on. "Do you ever feel angry at my father?" Thomas asked. "For what he did to your family?" Ilse considered the question carefully. "I was angry when I was younger. When my mother first told me about the bombing, about meeting the pilot, I thought she was betraying herself. Giving sympathy to the enemy. But I was 17 and understood the world in black and white. Heroes and villains. Us and them. And now. Now I understand that my mother wasn't betraying herself. She was saving herself. She could have spent her entire life consumed by rage at your father, at America, at the world that allowed such things to happen. And that rage would have been justified. But it also would have destroyed her. By choosing to see your father as human, by engaging with the complexity instead of the simplicity, she gave herself room to be more than just a victim." They reached Mohrenberg Street. The lot where Margaret's childhood home had stood was now occupied by a nondescript apartment building from the 1950s. Only the memorial marker indicated that anything significant had happened there. "Your grandfather and my grandmother were on opposite ends of a bomb trajectory," Ilse said. "That's a strange connection. But it became something meaningful because they both chose to honor it. They could have walked away from each other. Your grandfather could have decided his guilt was too much to confront. My grandmother could have decided her anger was too precious to release. But they didn't. They chose the harder path." "What path was that?" Thomas asked. "The path of acknowledging that war makes monsters of ordinary people, and that we have to find ways to become human again afterward. Your grandfather participated in killing my great-grandmother and 42 other civilians. That's true. My country started a war that killed millions and tried to exterminate entire peoples. That's also true. Both things can be true simultaneously. And healing requires holding both truths without trying to make one excuse the other." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "I wish I'd known my father better. I wish I'd asked him about the war while he was alive. I assumed his silence meant he'd made peace with it. Or maybe his silence meant he could never make peace with it," Ilse suggested. "Maybe the letters to my mother were the only place he felt safe being honest." They stood together at the memorial, two people connected by tragedy they hadn't personally experienced but had inherited nonetheless. The children of people who'd been damaged by war, carrying forward the work of making sense of that damage. What do we do with this? Thomas asked. With our parents' story? Does it mean something beyond just them? I think it means we have to resist abstraction, Ilse said. Every time someone talks about military necessity or acceptable casualties or strategic objectives, we have to remember there are people beneath those abstractions. Real people with names and families and futures. Your grandfather forgot that when he was 23 and bombing Germany. My grandmother never got the chance to forget it. But they both learned it eventually. And maybe that's the lesson we're supposed to carry forward. How do we do that? By telling their story. By refusing to let it become a comfortable narrative about reconciliation and healing. The truth is messier. They didn't forgive each other in any simple way. They just acknowledged each other's humanity and carried that acknowledgement forward. That's harder than forgiveness. But it's also more honest. The sun was setting over Gotha. Long shadows stretched across Mohrenberg Street, the same quality of light that Margaret's mother might have seen 74 years ago, shaking out a tablecloth on an ordinary February morning before the sirens began. Ilse thought about her mother, who'd lived to 82 despite predictions that she'd never recover from her war trauma. Who'd built a life despite nightmares that never completely stopped. Who'd found meaning not in forgetting but in transforming pain into understanding. And Thomas thought about his father, who'd carried guilt for decades in silence. Who'd flown 25 missions believing he was doing the right thing. Who'd spent the last 17 years of his life writing letters to a woman he tried to kill, trying to understand how good intentions had led to terrible consequences. Both of them, across the gap between bomber and bombed, had tried to be decent people in an indecent situation. They'd failed in many ways. But they'd also succeeded in one crucial way: they'd refused to let the war define them completely. They'd insisted on their humanity even when war tried to reduce them to categories. Aggressor and victim. Enemy and ally. Abstract coordinates in strategic calculations. They'd insisted on being James and Margaret. Two people who'd been damaged by the same war in different ways and who'd found a way to acknowledge that damage without pretending it could be erased. Your mother was remarkable, Thomas said. So was your father, Ilse replied. They were both ordinary people who chose to do something extraordinary. They chose to see each other. And in that seeing, in that refusal to look away from the human cost of their war, they'd created something that lasted beyond their lives. Not reconciliation in any simple sense. But recognition. Acknowledgement. The patient work of bearing witness to each other's wounds. The memorial marker would stand on Mohrenberg Street long after everyone who remembered February 22, 1944 had died. Long after the last survivor, the last veteran, the last person who'd lived through the war had gone. It would stand as a reminder that beneath every military operation, every strategic decision, every calculation of acceptable cost, there are always people. Real people with names and faces and stories that deserve to be told. Anna Schaller. Who loved music and gardening and made the best potato pancakes in her neighborhood. Who died at 36 because someone calculated that destroying a factory was worth the cost of the lives around it. And that calculation, perhaps, is what needs to be remembered most. Not to condemn the men who made it, who did what they believed necessary in the context of total war. But to question the framework that made such calculations seem reasonable. To insist that military necessity never fully justifies human cost. To remember that every abstraction has a face, and that face deserves to be seen. Margaret saw James Mahaffey's face. And in seeing it, she transformed her trauma from an unchangeable fact into a story she could integrate into her life. James saw Margaret's face. And in seeing it, he transformed his guilt from a paralyzing burden into a weight he could carry with purpose. They didn't erase what happened on February 22, 1944. They couldn't. But they proved that even the deepest wounds can be transformed. Not healed, not erased, but changed into something that allows life to continue. And that, perhaps, is the only reconciliation possible after war. Not forgetting, not forgiving necessarily, but finding a way to carry the weight together. Different sides of the same wound, working towards something that resembles peace. The shadows lengthened on Mohrenberg Street. Ilse and Thomas stood in silence, honoring the people who'd come before them. The dead who couldn't speak for themselves. The survivors who'd found words when words seemed impossible. The weight of history, still present, still real, but perhaps a little lighter for being acknowledged. They turned and walked back toward the city center together, two people connected by tragedy, carrying forward a story about what it means to be human in the aftermath of inhumanity. The street behind them grew quiet as evening came. But the names on the memorial remained, waiting for the next person who would stop and read and remember. And in remembering, perhaps find something that resembled hope.